Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I'm thrilled to have a return guest, Dr. David Ley, who, since the last time I interviewed him, has written a book called Ethical Porn for Dicks, A Man's Guide to Responsible Viewing Pleasure. And this is a really important topic that I wanted to make sure we covered because as I've been doing a lot of work, especially within Mormonism and trying to dispel some of the myths and fears and concerns that we have around pornography viewing, this is the question that comes up the most at the end of those discussions. It's like, okay, well, maybe it isn't an addiction and maybe I can separate out my moral values from behavior that maybe I'm not religiously comfortable with, etc. But when it comes right down to it, isn't this industry harmful and isn't it unethical, and shouldn't we be concerned about those kinds of issues that are more social or sexual health issues? So I think that you do a great job, Dr. Ley, of addressing a lot of those concerns and issues in this book. I know that the title might be off-putting to some of my audience, but I really encourage people to get past that because it's just really chock full of great information and would really like to help you promote it. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, I have to say that, the title was an interesting kind of journey for this book. I mean, the original title of the book was going to be A Gentleman's Guide to Porn Use. And I really wanted to, kind of confront the ideas that anybody who uses pornography is inherently a scummy, irresponsible, out of control pervert. But unfortunately, with the publishing industry, getting a book published, it's got to sell. And the younger male audience and men in our society, I think, unfortunately, are just not really interested in the concept of, being gentlemen or really, kind of some of the ideas that I grew up with around personal honor and responsibility. And I think that's sad. But by writing the book with this kind of catchy title, sort of the play on words, and that kind of in-your-face kind of challenge, can you watch pornography and not be a dick? Can you watch pornography in an ethical, responsible way that still acknowledges and explores the concept of pleasure, which is what sexuality and watching pornography is about? The title caught enough of those things that it hopefully makes people kind of take a moment and pause and examine some of their assumptions. Now, for your audience, I do cuss in the book because, again, I wrote it for men, and I wrote it for the majority general kind of audience of men, and who oftentimes don't read, sadly. And so I wrote the book in chunks that are short enough to read on the toilet. I wrote it as though I was having a conversation over a beer with a buddy, as opposed to being a therapist and lecturing at somebody. I was really trying to make something accessible so that guys would start to explore some of these ideas. But ultimately, what I want is a book and a dialogue and a story that invites people to now start thinking about what role pornography and sexuality in general plays in their life in a conscious kind of way. Now, I will point out that 50 Shades of Grey became immensely popular, one of the most popular books in history, second to the Bible in some cases, starting because women were reading it on their Kindle and their ebook readers because they could read it privately. So, if your audience is concerned about the title, and people seeing them read a book with that title, then they can just download it on Kindle and they can read it privately and make it just as popular as 50 Shades of Grey. I would not be at all upset about that.
That sounds like a good plan. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to write to men in particular versus women, and whether or not you think women would find this book useful? Because, well, I definitely found it useful. I think women would find it useful. Your thoughts about that?
Well, thanks. Thanks. I mean, I like that question. I wrote the book for men, and I get challenged by this sometimes. Some women have said, well, when are you going to write a book for women, and why aren't you worried about women? And here's the answer. The answer is, it is men who are getting in trouble, suffering consequences at work, losing their jobs, losing marriages, and suffering the most pain over pornography use. Women are very, very rarely in our society suffering exposure, humiliation, divorce, loss of job, because of being exposed for pornography use. Now, I think that comes out of a lot of different things, some of the differences between men and women. Men are more oftentimes using pornography as a coping mechanism for dealing with negative emotions like stress and depression. And unfortunately, men, compared to women, oftentimes have a deficit in coping skills. Women are taught from a young age how to cope with negative emotions, how to express them, how to deal with them, and they have a diversity in many cases, many different baskets that they can put their coping problems in. Men oftentimes only have a few. If that. And so many of the men that I see that are getting in trouble for porn use are men who don't have any other ways to manage their negative feelings. And pornography, makes you feel better. Pornography and masturbation, are a very, very effective way to make negative feelings go away. And men don't have much help in figuring out how to deal with that. So I wrote the book for men because they're the ones that are suffering this. They're the ones that are experiencing these problems the most. They're the ones, frankly, that are least prepared to effectively manage these issues. Now, I don't think I talked about it in this book, but in Brazil, a couple of years ago, a woman actually won a lawsuit where she was given the legal right to watch pornography at work during breaks because she had essentially a medical kind of hypersexual sort of condition. And she was granted that right of looking at pornography as a disability right. There is not a single case in history of a man being granted that same kind of right. And I don't think there really ever will be, because unfortunately we look at male sexuality with a great deal of skepticism. We look at male sexuality oftentimes as though it is inherently uncontrollable, as though it is inherently kind of lustful and potentially evil and has to be constantly restrained or distrusted. What that leads to is it leads to men having a whole lot of shame and fear about their sexuality. And so there are lots of men who are watching pornography and are a little bit nervous about it. A few years ago, I did this TV show with Katie Couric, and it was about pornography, and it was a really challenging experience. It was probably one of the most difficult media experiences I've ever had, and I do a lot of media. And, Katie Couric, at one point she was just, scratching her head, and she said, Dr. Lay, if you talk about research one more time, I'm just going to hit myself. I'm going to hit myself in the head. And it made me realize, number one, that Katie, like a lot of women and a lot of people in our society, just held a deep distrust of pornography that no matter how much research we gave her, was not going to get through because of her instinctive truth. She even said, what about common sense? Now, I walked out of that and I said, that there's a point there. Instead of talking about research so much, we need to be trying to provide this information in an accessible kind of way that acknowledges there are some real risks and harms here, and acknowledges the positives as well. Now, the other thing about that experience was that I went back to the hotel and, I was at the bar and I was really feeling miserable. Frankly, I had a little bit too much to drink. And I was talking with some of the other guys at the bar and the bartender about that experience. They were all men, and they all said, "Oh, dude, that's really crappy that happened to you." And they all said, "Yeah, I watch pornography." And they all said, "Yeah, I'm nervous sometimes about getting in trouble, getting in trouble with my wife or girlfriend, and I don't know who to talk to or how to talk about it." So it was that experience in a lot of ways that led to this book. Now, being a smart aleck, I actually dedicated the book to Katie Couric, which I don't know if she knows that. I'd love to send her a copy. If I run into her, I look forward to being able to share that with her. But so that's kind of where the book came from, and it really comes from a deep place for me of empathy with men. And that, interestingly, has been the more positive experience that I've heard from women. I've heard a lot of women who bought the book for their husbands or boyfriends and then read it themselves and came back and said, "This really helped me understand my husband's sexual desires better than I ever had before." And it gave them empathy for some of the masculine sexuality that they used to fear and distrust.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between morality and ethics? I thought that was a really important part of your first chapter as far as framing the types of discussions we're going to have around this topic.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Natasha, you're the first person to ever kind of ask about that. Good for you. I, my original degree is in philosophy. And it drove my dad nuts. My dad was a colonel in the army, and he used to tease me because he'd say, I looked in the newspaper and there's no jobs for philosophers. And I said, well,
Right.
yeah, they're there, but they're listed under landscaping and fast food. He didn't think it was very funny. I thought it was hysterical, but he's right. There's just not much call these days for philosophers. But in writing this book, I was able to bring some of that, kind of training and thinking back into this, and it was kind of fun. Morality is more around kind of what is right or wrong, and it's really kind of driven more from that gut sense of what is good, what is evil, what is right, what is wrong, what is healthy or unhealthy. Ethics are the rules that we sort of put in place in order to try to achieve moral outcomes. And while these two things often overlap, they don't necessarily end up at the same place. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to invite people to kind of explore both of those aspects for themselves, to think about what are the things that you think are right and wrong, what are the things that you think are healthy or unhealthy, what are the things about sex especially that you think are good or bad or evil. And now let's look at the rules or the way in which you are practicing those behaviors, because that's where the conflict ends up happening a lot of times. So, for instance, one of the things I talk about often is that people who engage in casual sex feel bad afterwards if they were a person who thinks that casual sex is slutty or bad or immoral. Now, with casual sex, 90% of casual sex involves alcohol. And one of the reasons for that is people use alcohol to get over those internal prohibitions against engaging in this behavior. They want to engage in the behavior. They're tempted to engage in casual sex, but they use alcohol. They get drunk so that they can do something that they would not normally do. Then the next day, they feel bad. They're hungover and they feel guilty. What we know now about pornography is that people who suffer the most around pornography are people who believe that masturbation and pornography use and sexuality in general have a lot of negatives. These are people who hold a lot of moral prohibitions against pornography and against masturbation and against any kind of sexual diversity, sex outside marriage, sex before marriage, sex that is casual or sex that is not for love, even just masturbation or fantasies about things other than your main partner. A lot of people hold these kinds of experiences to be immoral or dangerous or unhealthy. And then if they engage in those behaviors, like pornography, they feel bad afterwards. Now, what happens then is they keep it secret. They try and keep it secret from themselves. They hide from it. They bury it. They try and, avoid looking at it. They try and avoid thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, they get turned on again, or they get a desire, or they're lonely or horny. Sam Brownback was a governor of Kansas, and or is governor of Kansas. When he was senator, he held these hearings about pornography, and he told a story of men who, when they checked into the hotel, they had to have the television removed so that in the middle of the night they wouldn't be tempted to watch pornography. Well, Brownback tells that story in terms of saying, look how dangerous pornography is, that it made these men, have to go to such lengths. I tell that same story to patients as a way of saying, look, this is how smart these guys were. They knew that in the middle of the night, when they're away from their family, they're tired, they're lonely, they're maybe a little horny, that those men might be tempted to do something that would disagree with their values. So instead of suffering, they acted in advance so that they could construct the situation to make it easier for them to engage in behaviors that are consistent with their values. Then they don't feel bad the next morning. That, I think, ultimately is one of the best models that I present in this book. Is the way to resolve a lot of this pain is to sit and look and think about your values and beliefs around sex. Now, unfortunately, we don't usually encourage people to do that. We don't tell people, hey, when you're not turned on, why don't you sit down and think about how you feel about pornography or masturbation. When you're not turned on, why don't you sit and talk with your wife or your girlfriend or your husband or whatever about what you want sexually and how you would like to be able to negotiate that. Unfortunately, sex remains this dirty secret that then we feel bad about later when we engage in it. The point of this book is to really invite people to explore those dirty secrets, to drag those dirty secrets out and explore them, and then try to figure out, are there conscious, mindful ways that we can resolve some of those dilemmas? Now, early on, you said something about, isn't pornography an immoral and exploitive kind of industry? A lot of people have those feelings, and to a degree, so do I. However, that doesn't mean that I should never watch pornography. And it doesn't mean that I will automatically feel guilty and bad if I do watch pornography. What it does mean is that I need to reconcile now my sexual desires and my ethical beliefs. Here's a good example. So, I love to drink coffee, and and when I got married, I bought my wife a dime. But coffee is often farmed by people that are in slavery, and the blood trade diamond industry is a really ugly one. So when I drink coffee, I try to drink fair trade coffee, where I know that it was farmed by people who were not being exploited. When I bought my wife a diamond ring, I bought her a conflict-free diamond so that I didn't have to put something on her finger as a symbol of our love that was something that represented exploitation, where people had been harmed and enslaved and taken advantage of. We can do the same thing with pornography. There's lots of people who watch pornography and then they feel bad afterwards because they worry, oh, all the women in pornography are being abused, or all these people are being taken advantage of. All these performers are on drugs. So then the answer to that is, look, if you want to watch pornography and you feel bad about those things, then what if we could help you find pornography where it was all consensual? The performers were of age, they were consenting, they were doing stuff they wanted to do, they weren't being taken advantage of, they weren't drunk, they weren't unhealthy people being exploited. Would that make you feel better? And if we can offer that way of resolving our morality and our ethics, oftentimes a lot of these problems around pornography move away. That actually is one of the conversations that I help a lot of men have with their wives around pornography use, because a lot of women have those concerns. They are concerned that women in pornography are being exploited, and that if their husband is watching that their husband is kind of vicariously participating in that abuse of women or that misogynistic kind of exploitation. And so I say to women, well, what if your husband was watching pornography where women weren't being taken advantage of, where we knew these women were safe? What if they were watching ethical feminist pornography that was produced by women who were really connected and supporting the idea of female empowerment? And women go, there is such a thing? And I say, yeah, there is. Now, it takes some work to find it. And it really takes some commitment to these sorts of ideas and beliefs. But if you reconcile your beliefs, your morals, your ideas, and your behavior, then almost all of these problems, all these guilty feelings, all this shame around sexuality and pornography use goes away.
You definitely bring up interesting points that I want to dive into. And before we go there, what we've seen, unfortunately, is the other extreme, which is, since there does exist some of these things like sex trafficking and exploitation and abuses, then let's just get rid of porn altogether. One of the things that I love about your book is all these caricatures, or I guess characters that you want to mention, that come from cave dwellings that show very sexually explicit forms of the human back in the day. So porn is kind of here to stay, and it's been around really forever in all kinds of forms of art, whether it's literature or video. And yes, we've seen some changes obviously with the internet, but I'm a little bit concerned when we have issues such as in Utah, where there's a porn crisis that's legislated into the legal system, and then all these efforts to get rid of something that is just not going away. And I feel like those are really wasted efforts. So can you talk a little bit about what we do know when people try to legislate against pornography, and some of the laws of the land that we do have already in place that help us navigate ethical use of these materials, etc.?
Yeah, so, first, let me, again, I wrote this book for guys, and so, in the interest of trying to make the book accessible, we made it a picture book, but we didn't want to make a book that was too dirty, with pornography, because then the book would not be readable by lots of people, and it would end up on the porn section of the bookshelf. So we illustrated the book with what I call petroporn, which are cave drawings, petroglyphs from around the world. And every continent on the planet, other than Antarctica, as far as we know, has erotic cave drawings that are in many cases thousands of years old. There is nothing in modern pornography that doesn't exist chiseled on the walls of caves by people, hundreds and thousands of years ago, who had a hot night and they wanted to memorialize it, or they had a fantasy that they wanted to chisel onto a wall so that they could see it. And visual depictions of sexuality have been around as long as humans have. It is a way that we express and connect and share our sexuality with other people. Unfortunately, in places throughout the world, and including in Utah, there are sexual petroglyphs that have been chiseled off the wall, that have been defaced and covered up by oftentimes religious settlers who were challenged by that sexuality, who didn't want people to see or witness that sexuality. So this conflict between religion, society, and pornography, or the sexual material, is really old. Interestingly, in Australia and in Pompeii, for instance, a lot of these sexual drawings and materials, they were only accessible to the wealthy and to powerful men in many cases. Women and children and poor people weren't allowed to access them. What the internet does, and I think one of the reasons that the internet is so challenging to lots of people around this, is that it is democratizing sexuality. It is taking away the ability of society, and in some cases religious organizations, to say to somebody that your sexual desires are unhealthy and you should be ashamed of them. You should try to not have those sexual desires. You should put those away. because now you can jump on the internet and you can find pornography that is your kind of sexuality and find out that there are other people out there who share that. And it leads people to push back and say, now, wait a minute. This thing that you've told me to be ashamed of, actually, there's lots of other people out there who share that. So maybe you're wrong. Now, one of the things that I think is really kind of unfortunate and sad is that these modern legal battles against pornography, declaring pornography a public health crisis, blaming pornography for all kinds of social ills, they're a distraction. What really is going on is that the internet has offered sexual experiences and sexual stimuli to people who were never prepared to deal with them. I like to say, the internet offers a wide and deep pool of sexual experiences to people who we as a society have never taught to swim. Now, if somebody goes to the beach and they jump in the water and they drown because nobody ever taught them to swim, we don't blame the water. Instead, we blame that person and we blame the people around them for failing to teach them how to swim and be responsible. We as a society have grossly neglected especially our adolescents, to whom we are giving, inadequate levels of sex education that doesn't prepare them for the real world that is out there. I know that religious communities would like to go back in time to a world before, the internet offered this kind of sexual opportunity to children and to teens and to all these people out there, but we can't. And so instead, we need to start taking the responsibility, the social responsibility, to prepare our teens and our children and each other to manage this world. Now, again, in Utah, I think it's really sad. The same week that they recently introduced legislation declaring pornography a public health crisis and trying to create laws where people can sue pornography producers when teens see pornography, that same week, Utah also acted against providing comprehensive sex education to adolescents in Utah. Unfortunately, I think that's a travesty. Now, the problems that we are seeing at social levels around sexuality, they come out of our lack of preparation for people around these issues. One of the studies that I talk about often, especially around adolescents, we are all afraid that pornography has this gross, dangerous, damaging effect on adolescents. And there's actually research that suggests that, in fact, it does. Unfortunately, that in this research from the Netherlands, where they looked at adolescents over time, they showed that exposure to pornography, sexually explicit material, did predict later life problems about a year later in those adolescents. However, it only predicted about 1% of the variance. In other words, what that means is 99% of the reasons that kids get into trouble come out of lots of other issues: education, healthcare, mental health, physical health, poverty, family environment. Back in 1919, our country tried to ban alcohol, or did ban alcohol. And the idea back then was that alcohol was the cause of mental retardation. Alcohol was the cause of divorce, crime, poverty, all kinds of social problems. The United States banned alcohol, but 10 years later, all of those problems were still there. And we recognized that alcohol was oftentimes, in those cases, a symptom of a problem and a part of the problem, but not the entirety of the problem. I think it is tragic right now that in these ongoing social conversations about the dangers of pornography, we're not recognizing that porn is a problem in people where it is a symptom of other issues. And what we need to do is treat those other issues. Lots of laws already exist. In fact, the United States porn industry is probably the safest porn industry in the world. And the more we make it illegal, the more we make it go underground, the less safe it becomes, and the more likely we end up with an industry that is exploitive, that is violating people's consent and forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. That's unhealthy and that's unethical.
So a big part of your message throughout this entire book is helping consumers, quote unquote, vote for ethical porn, right? As far as what we're clicking on, what we're looking at, and being wise consumers. I'd like to go through your list of defining ethical porn, if that's possible, on page 33, if you don't mind. I'm just going to read through a few of these ways that you
go for it. Good, because I don't
this.
remember what I put on that page.
Okay, so we're looking at material that would be made legally, that respects the rights of performers, pays performers for their labor, respects copyrights of the producer, shows both fantasy sex and real-world sex so that we can see and explore both. So that was an interesting point. It's diverse, so showing all the different flavors that are out there. And I think what you mean by that is not just diverse in sexual preference, but diverse also in people, size, disability, race, culture, etc. Celebrates sexuality as diverse, complex, and multifaceted without saying that there's a right or wrong way to be sexual. Is made by people who are trying to make, quote unquote, better porn, is watched by people who want there to be, quote unquote, better porn, and treats both performers and consumers of porn as free, consenting, thinking, and powerful beings. Which is really interesting because I think one of the biases that I had to really catch myself on as I became a sex certified and became a sex therapist myself was this projection that I had, especially of female performers, that even though they were saying things like, yes, I enjoy doing this work and I want to be paid well, and I well, not that I want to be, they are paid well, that I would project my own judgment and say, well, they can't really like it. They just say they like it, or they've been brainwashed by our culture to objectify themselves as female sexual objects, et cetera, et cetera. So those were a lot of the biases I had to face in myself as I got to chat with some female performers throughout my training, and also just read and be aware of other people's experiences. So do you want to talk a little bit about that whole objectification process, and even how we define, well, first of all, how we define and look at objectification, and also maybe how we define and think about the word exploitation?
Thanks for reading that list. I mean, I think that it invites us to start thinking again about how we are ethical consumers. My wife boycotts all kinds of things, all kinds of companies that she disagrees with their practices. Whether it is because they manufacture their materials in sweatshops or other sorts of things. And I've always kind of admired that. Now, one of the only things that I really kind of boycott is entertainment material that is based on serial killers. For some reason, years ago, I remember, I went through that little phase a lot of people go through, where I was reading, serial killer books and watching, Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal and stuff like that. But I realized at some point, especially as I was, starting to work with adolescents, I realized that we were creating a social image where it was cooler to be a serial killer than it was to be a fireman or to be a doctor. And I realized that I didn't want to support that anymore. That I wanted to support young people in our society seeing it as cool to be a responsible, caring, empathic person and not a monster. So I consciously chose to not watch those movies or read those books anymore. And I think that there is some of that same kind of conscious consideration that we can do around sexuality. Now, I had a lot of those same biases that you had, that you identified. But, I worked with this story around this woman who was a college student in Ivy League school on the East Coast, and she was a porn performer. She was paying her way through this Ivy League college by doing porn on the side. And one of the kinds of porn that she did was this pretty abusive and misogynistic, kind of aggressive sorts of porn, where the female porn performers are treated very poorly. Now, it is consensual porn. The women sign up for that. They know what it is going in. But I got to tell you, it is stuff that it makes my stomach hurt just knowing it's out there. It is not something that I would find arousing. But, I think that there is recognition that, sexual diversity comes in lots and lots of flavors. And just because I am not turned on by something doesn't mean that nobody should be. But I read this interview with this performer where she talked about that experience. And she said that she went into it with her eyes open and that she knew what it was going to be. And that she actually had a lot of deep-seated sort of pain that she had experienced through her life, a lot of self-consciousness about herself and her body. And that going through that experience actually helped her deal with and express some of those feelings. Now, I thought that was really extraordinary. And, it's kind of similar to the idea that a lot of therapists have that, bondage and discipline, sadomasochistic kind of behaviors are inherently coming from an unhealthy place. But in fact, there are now a lot of therapists who are realizing that there are a lot of people who use those kinds of practices, whether it's spanking or whipping or being tied up or whatever, as a way to actually overcome a history of traumatic experiences and to recreate new kind of narratives about that kind of experience. That was one of the things that I thought that was just really, really interesting and again, helped me to sort of reframe and to recognize again that my biases might intrude and prevent, in fact, people from encountering and experiencing some healthy things. I worked with this young man who watched that kind of pornography, and he was a pretty scary young man. He was 17 years old. He had some substance use issues. He had fantasies of raping and killing people. And watching that pornography was part of this for him, and it was pretty frightening for therapists and for myself. But I didn't tell him don't watch that pornography. Instead, I started working with him about where that anger and where that sadness, where that fear came from. And he was a young man who had been, kind of emotionally betrayed and let down by all the women in his life, adult mother, grandmother, sister, teachers. He had a litany of all the women that had let him down. And he was angry about that. He was sad about that. So we did a lot of work helping him to recognize that his future was not like his past, that all the women in the world were not like those women that he had experienced those things with. One day he got a date. I helped him recognize that a woman was flirting with him in one of his college classes. I got him out of his house, got him going to college. He started interacting with people. We broke through some of the isolation that was feeding some of these negative feelings. And he started dating a young woman, but he couldn't have an orgasm with her. He couldn't trust her enough to relax enough to have an orgasm because women were the people that had hurt him, and he was worried she was going to hurt him if he loved her or trusted her. Well, eventually, as we're working on how to have a good relationship, how to be a good lover, because he didn't know anything about being sexual, even though he had watched lots of pornography and he thought he was a good lover. He actually wasn't. So we worked on all these issues. And again, I never told him, don't watch that pornography. I never told him that pornography is unhealthy. Instead, I looked at that pornography as a symptom, as an expression of something that was attractive to him inside emotionally that he was working through. Eventually, one day he came in and he had an orgasm with his girlfriend because he had loved her. He had fallen in love with her, he was trusting her, and he was now able to do that. And I asked him at that moment, as he told me about it, I said, well, what about that abusive pornography you were watching? What about that misogynistic kind of pornography? I didn't use those terms, and he said, it's the funniest thing. He said he went to watch that pornography a few weeks before, and he felt bad for the women in it. Whereas it used to turn him on because it connected with his anger and his fear and his sadness. Now he had learned to empathize with women, and he no longer found that arousing. I couldn't have gotten there by telling him don't watch that pornography. We had to get there by dealing with all of these other issues that represented. And so I think that we treat pornography and we treat sexuality as though it is the whole of the issue. We treat it oftentimes as though it's the answer It's not. It's usually just an indicator, just a signpost to other issues. It's a symptom of other problems. And if we over focus on the symptom, we miss treating all of the other issues. If we had told that guy, you shouldn't be watching that pornography, well, A, he wouldn't have come to therapy. B, he would have felt shamed and he would have kept it secret. C, he would have been kind of angry at us for trying to control him, like other people had tried to control him. We would have just tapped into all of that. So instead, I had to learn, what does that pornography mean for you? And are there things I can help you with in there? Now, objectification is really an aspect of normal sexuality. We actually do objectify people in very healthy ways. We teach soldiers to objectify the enemy, to call them names like raghead or gook or whatever, so that soldiers can do the very hard, challenging, traumatic job that we ask them to do and go defend our society. And objectification is a healthy way that we help them to do that, to reduce some of the potential trauma they would feel later on from having done these awful kinds of things in wartime. We teach surgeons to objectify their patient. When a surgeon is cutting into their patient, it actually helps the surgeon to not think about this patient as a thinking, feeling human being, but to just kind of think about them as something on the table that I got to work with and do my job, because that then helps them relieve some of their anxiety and the pressure, and lets them be calm and do their job. Objectification is not necessarily a healthy thing, but it is a human behavior that can be healthy and unhealthy. Sex and pornography are not the only place where we do this, where we exploit people. One of the things I'm really troubled, frankly, by, and that is a much, 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 much larger and significant industry than pornography, is professional sports. I mean, last year we found out that the NFL had been covering up evidence of, concussion and brain trauma in NFL players for decades. And, as a man who's worked most of my career with, impoverished people in the ghettos, African American youth in poorer areas of town, most of those kids, they have this kind of fantasy that, being a professional basketball player or professional football player is their way out. And it's sad to me that industry is exploiting so many of those young men and harming them physically for our entertainment. If you want to feel guilty about something, I think we should feel guilty about watching, Super Bowl Sunday, knowing that those people are putting their brains and their lives and their relationships at risk, because a lot of that concussive brain trauma can lead to things like domestic violence and impulsive, dangerous behaviors. But they're doing that for our enjoyment. I think we as a society need to wrestle with that just as much as we need to wrestle with these issues around pornography. We single out sexuality and pornography as though it's something special and separate. It's not. The way that we have, a safe, healthy pornography industry is the same way we have a safe, healthy society. And that we need to stop blaming pornography for these things that are really in us already. And we need to deal with those issues in us.
I love that example you gave of the teenage boy that you met with, which in so many, unfortunately, areas, he would have just been thrown into a porn addiction type of setting, clinical setting. And instead, you were really able to do some really great work there. And that's true of many things. I mean, that I hear concerns about, anime porn, child pornography, incest porn. There's, a lot of different themes out there that, of course, can bring up a lot of real concerns and issues, as they should. I'm not trying to minimize those issues, but again, those issues do not only exist in pornography. Those issues exist in our societies, and they exist for very complex reasons. And I like you mentioning that for a lot of people, revisiting those or finding those things sexually erotic is actually part of their healing with a safe, consensual partner, or
Totally.
a consensual way of working through those issues as a worker versus projecting our own ideas onto people.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'll say also, it's one of the reasons I'm really glad folks like you are doing these kinds of podcasts, because there is such a need to educate other therapists about these issues. I travel the country and I do continuing education trainings for therapists, and only around 5 to 10% of therapists have any training on sexuality issues, which is really just tragic and sad, because what it means then is that when those therapists run into sexual issues in their patients, they don't have any training to deal with them, and they respond to them based solely upon their own kind of experience, their own sort of beliefs and thoughts around sexuality and what they've heard in the pop media. So that you're right. Most therapists have no training or thinking about how to approach or understand what role pornography has in their life, and so in a person's life, and so when they see it in a patient, they jump to, oh, this is a problem, we need to stop that problem, we need to deal with that problem, we need to make that problem go away. And now I'm going around the country and I'm training therapists how to approach these issues without kind of judgment and shame. Because what happens when we as a therapist respond to those issues in that way is that the patients don't come back, or they end up feeling worse. What we know now is that the belief that somebody is a porn addict, first, porn addiction is predominantly diagnosed by religious therapists. Secondly, the identity of oneself being a porn addict is predicted not by how much pornography you watch, but by your religious values. And if you have values or moral values that conflict with pornography, you are more likely to self-identify as a porn addict, regardless of how much porn you watch. So what we know now is that these pseudo-therapeutic ideas of porn addiction and sex addiction, they are really just medicalized sexual shame. And unfortunately, it doesn't help people that seeing yourself as addicted to porn or seeing yourself as unable to control these desires actually makes people feel worse, not better. It doesn't give them more control. It actually gives them less. It makes them less likely to be able to think about this behavior in a healthy, mindful kind of way. I think we kind of need to move beyond those concepts and start dealing with what this really is, which is that unfortunately we have not done a good job, especially in religious communities, of preparing people for healthy sexuality. Now, as I wrestle with these issues, and I do trainings around helping therapists to deal with patients that are struggling with these religious sexual conflicts, participating in religious communities is incredibly healthy and positive for so many people in so many ways. That participating in religious communities, being a devout member of a religious organization, reduces the chances that they will develop substance use issues and reduces the chances that they will develop mental health problems. But unfortunately, it increases the chances that they'll develop a sexual disorder, and that they will feel these kinds of challenges around sexual shame. What we need is to help folks start developing ideas and directions about how they can be an ethical sexual being within their religion. One of the places I point people to is the Religious Institute, which is a consortium of about 5,000 pastors and ministers from around the world who've come together and said, look, we need to figure out how to help our congregants develop healthy sexual values around justice and consent and mutuality, responsibility, respect, and dignity within their sexuality, instead of what we used to do, which was tell them, don't do this, do this. I think we need to move beyond that. Now, one of the other things that I often recommend people in religious communities to look at is the lovely piece written by a Mormon man in Utah named Paul Malan. His last name is Malan, and it's called The Naked People in Your iPod. And Paul is just a writer, and he's a thinker, and he wrote this amazing piece for his sons about helping them to understand the conflict that they were feeling about the fact that they could find pornography, naked people, using their iPods, and they weren't prepared for that because of the religious training they had gotten, and that they were feeling a lot of conflict. One of the points that Paul makes is, religion, and unfortunately the Church of Latter-day Saints, has not been very good at dealing with these sexual issues in kind of a sort of healthy, empowering way. He also points out that they conflate, they combine, they treat the issue of pornography and sexual arousal as though they're the same thing, which then leads to somebody who, for instance, is struggling with pornography, feeling ashamed and problematic anytime they get sexually aroused. Paul suggests, helping his sons and the readers think about all these ideas that I've talked about in this book and that we've talked about today. How can you be a person of integrity? How can you be an ethical person when you're being a sexual person? And I think that what that means is that we need to start thinking about our own desires. We need to learn how to communicate with our partners about their desires. We need to negotiate kind of win-win sorts of situations with our husbands and our wives about our sexual desires and their sexual desires, and how we can meet in the middle in a healthy, safe, consensual, negotiated, ethical way. That's how we become a sexual person of honor. That's how we can reconcile our sexual desires with our desires to be a good person and feel good the next morning. And as I help patients think through these things and start gaining greater control of their behaviors, they then can sometimes go and engage in the exact same behavior that they did before and they felt bad about. But because now they're thinking about how they want to do it and how they can do it in a responsible, ethical, conscious way, the next morning they don't feel bad, because they have thought through these things, and then they've negotiated solutions to the moral conflicts that were really the things that were causing the pain. That's one of the things that I think is so powerful about, your podcast, is that you're reaching out to people who are struggling with these issues, who are seeing the world become increasingly sexual. They're seeing sexual material and sexual opportunities available to themselves and their children, and they're kind of frightened about it. And I understand that fear. I empathize with it. I think that we can manage that fear better, not by burying our heads in the sand, which we all want to do, but instead by teaching ourselves and our children and each other how to be more accepting and less shaming. Unfortunately, shame is really the big problem here. Shame makes these things harder to change. It hurts more. It is what is causing most of the pain and the struggle and the suffering that is associated with pornography. If we can help people learn to address the origins of that shame, I think it's how we get to help people.
I'm so glad you brought up Paul's article. I know Paul, and just to give him a good shout out, he approached me and several other people before he published it to make sure he was on the up and up with what he was sharing.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I definitely gave him a thumbs up. I thought it was very well written as well. So I'll definitely link to that. Well, why don't we finish up then with some basic suggestions from your end as far as day-to-day ways that people can be more ethically mindful consumers, and with something maybe as simple as you mentioned, paying for the services that you get.
Yeah. The bad and unfortunate thing is that the most of the pornography that's out there on the internet is free, but as one of my favorite writers said, there really is just no such thing as a free lunch. And that when you download or watch that free pornography, you're paying for it actually in a couple of ways. One, you're paying for it by making yourself a recipient of advertising, because those sites have all this advertising, and frankly, a lot of the advertising is meant to make you feel insecure. A lot of the advertising is about how to make your penis larger, or how to make your penis harder, as ways to make men feel insecure about their penis, which is kind of sad. And then the guys, feel bad afterwards because they're like, wow, my penis isn't as hard as it is in all that pornography. Well, maybe it's the pornography, but maybe it's also the marketing that you're subjecting yourself to with this free pornography. Secondly, unfortunately, lots of that free pornography involves risk, because these tube sites that have lots of the pornography that people are watching, they are not legally responsible for that material. The way they work is that it's called user uploaded material. And so what happens is somebody uploads a video and the tube site hosts it and shows it. But if there's something illegal in that, say it's children or underage performers, or it's something that was gotten non-consensually. Some of these, horrific stories we've heard of women or teens being raped while somebody films it, and then they put that up on the internet. If you watch that, and then the FBI goes to that tube site, the tube site will share your information, your IP address, with the FBI, and then they'll take down the video. You are out on your own. You have no protection, and so you have no safety that you can trust the material on a lot of those tube sites. Now, in fairness to those tube sites, because of some of this pressure, because of some of these issues that are being raised, because of some of the challenges from the porn industry to these tube sites, most of that material is pirated, kind of like pirated music. It's stolen. The people who made it and the people who performed in it aren't getting any of the money from that marketing or advertising. And from pressure of people like me saying, we need to support more ethical porn that is safe. Some of those porn sites, like Pornhub now, actually has what they call verified performers, where they are amateurs who are still uploading their own material. But Pornhub has gone to them and said, hey, prove to us that you are who you say you are, and that you're of age, and that you are consenting to making this and producing this, putting this material out there. Now, if you look at that site, you can try and navigate and find and just look at verified performers so that you know that you're a little safer. But the best way to do this is to reach out and find reputable porn manufacturers, people like Vivid, or people like Pink and White Productions, people like Lush, which is an Australian group. These are groups who are, any material that they produce and make available is ethical, it is legal, it is made consensually, and you can watch it knowing that you're safe because you paid for it and you paid for safety. Now, sometimes people will say to me, well, but then my credit card is out there, then my credit card is in that company's information, and I could potentially get exposed as watching this material. And I said, well, yeah, would you rather get exposed for accidentally watching child porn, or would you rather get exposed for being a thoughtful, responsible adult who is paying for safe material? Pick your poison. Which do you want? I think that part of the issue there is really, again, our fear of sexuality, our fear of being shamed publicly around sexuality. One of the very, very sad stories was last year, I think, at the New Orleans Baptist Seminary, now down in Louisiana. A professor was lost to suicide, and he was a famous, well-loved professor. And he was lost to suicide, and the school said, well, it's because he was addicted to pornography. And they actually had a conference about the dangers and risks of pornography for people within religious traditions and communities. And they said, we need to reach out and help people about all of this. And it's sad, and I'm sad that man was lost in that circumstance. But as I dug into that story, I found out a little bit more, that he was actually exposed in the Ashley Madison scandal, where his name was in the Ashley Madison website as that site got hacked. His email was in the material that got released, showing that he had been on that site looking for illicit sex and infidelity. Now, it's fascinating to me that then it was presented as porn addiction as opposed to the issues around infidelity and casual sex and the struggles around sexuality that we have in our society. But he was lost to suicide because of sexual shame. He was lost to suicide because he was afraid of being exposed and suffering for these sexual desires that he had. That's what we need to deal with. That's what we need to address in order to help our brothers and sisters in religious communities who are struggling with these issues.
Yeah, because we can be brutal when it comes to the shaming process, for sure. Well, this has been an excellent interview as usual, Dr. Lay. I can't thank you enough for your time. I'd just like to open up for any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with.
What I am just so enthused and excited about is that there are more people like you and I who are raising these conversations, who are pushing back at the sexual shame forces, who are really calling out and saying, look, we want to help people, and shaming them and making them feel bad about this isn't working. We need a new way. I feel so blessed and so lucky that I have, friends and colleagues like yourself, like Kristen Hodson, like Paul Milan, who are out there pushing these questions, who are asking, is this really the best way we can help people? Because I think that there are other ways that might be more effective. That's how we get to move all of this forward. I think that, I hope your listeners have been convinced by me and, want to go out and buy my book and turn it into an instant bestseller. That'd be awesome. But what I really actually hope is that your listeners are listening to you and I and the other guests that you have on the show and starting to ask their own questions. That's how we move all of this forward. Not by me selling this book or even by you doing the podcast, but by lots of people out there starting to ask questions of themselves, their husband or wife, and their religious leaders about how to integrate sexuality in a healthy way within their life and their spirituality. That's how we get to help people move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lay. I always really enjoy my time with you.
Likewise. Thank you, Natasha.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.